The argument, as worded by Dr. Craig, goes like this.
The argument is a simple syllogism. Premise 1. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. 2. The universe began to exist. 3. Therefore, the universe has a cause.
1. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. Okay, so there is already a huge problem with the first premise. Namely that it hinges entirely on the definition of cause. This may sound like an arbitrary objection, but that's exactly why it's so easily overlooked. If you think about our use of language, you have to acknowledge that it cannot be used in some unambiguous, direct and logically stringent manner. In mathematical logic, it may be unambiguous to make a statement like, A implies B, A, therefore B, but in real life those variables often represent a hugely complicated state of affairs, and it is indispensable to pay strict attention to what is actually being stated. In this case, we need to examine what qualifies as sufficient cause. Imagine someone drawing a picture. What is its cause? The most obvious answer would be the person who painted it. But clearly, this is not all there is to be said about that particular cause. On the one hand, I could argue that, since in this particular case the picture was drawn on a computer, the mouse pointer is part of the cause since the lines followed the pointer. By extension, the graphics program, the operating system, the computer itself and even electricity are part of the cause of the painting. So in effect, people like Edison or Tesla are part of the cause of this particular image. On the other hand, there is the person painting the image, for example me, who is not an uncaused cause either. Countless more or less important impressions on and reactions in the brain, like me watching a video of Craig and deciding to discuss what he says, led to the creation of this drawing. My mood on this particular day, which affects my state of mind, my complete lack of artistic talent and many such individually seemingly irrelevant elements all play into the ultimate cause. Or take the weather. If someone asks you why it is raining, then indicating that there are clouds is only the most superficial reason. Sure, rain falls from clouds, but is that really a good enough answer in all cases? Certainly not in a class about meteorology. If you write a paper about rainfall, how in-depth do you need to go to cover all its aspects and influences to be able to claim you fully explained the cause of rain one particular day? It should be obvious that the only solution to a nearly infinitely complex task is to agree to stop at a certain point and define a certain answer as good enough. So in light of the initial question, what is a good enough explanation of the universe? It can be perfectly reasonable to assume that the Big Bang Theory is in fact a satisfyingly exhaustive explanation. Maybe the Standard Model is not exhaustive enough, but string theory is. Maybe M theory. But if you demand further details to questions that you feel are not adequately answered, then it is also perfectly reasonable to demand further details from the God hypothesis, thus making it an unsatisfactory answer to the question about the cause of the universe. So in the end, I think one ought to be highly skeptical of conclusions derived from a premise this poorly defined, because just as everyone has a different standard for what constitutes sufficient cause to begin with, everyone will have their own opinion on whether or not the cause that is arrived at in the conclusion is in fact sufficient explanation. 2. The universe began to exist. The problem with this statement is more technical, but as a result also less dependent on subjectivity. Theists have been having great fun pointing out that scientists acknowledge that the Big Bang Theory is probably not an exhaustive explanation of the origin of the universe, and therefore like to use this as proof that the universe did in fact begin to exist. The infinite regression problem of God has been addressed often enough and shall not be my concern here. There are, however, a few major problems with this assumption. I think a bit of backstory to the cosmological model is warranted. First, the Big Bang is not actually the beginning of everything. By definition, It is the common language's translation of the mathematical singularity you get when you extrapolate the observed expansion of the universe back in time. Neither is the concept of a literal explosion a particularly accurate image of the beginning of the expansion after a singularity, nor is it a complete explanation of our observations. In addition to the expansion of the universe, three very important observed properties of the universe are homogeneity, the sameness of the universe's properties at every location within, when viewed over large enough distances. The basic laws of nature are the same on every planet or in every galaxy and do not change over time. Isotropy, the roughly equal distribution of all its contents. When you look at the Hubble Deep Field images, you can see galaxies in every direction. Flatness, it has been measured that the entire observable universe is in fact flat, as opposed to space being curved, and thus Euclidean, that is to say even over the distances of billions of light-years. The sum of the interior angles in a triangle is 180 degrees. To explain these, cosmological inflation has been proposed. It is a very short amount of time in which the universe expanded much more rapidly than afterwards, an increase of a factor of 10 to the power of 26 in 10 to the power of minus 32 seconds. Now it is crucial to realize that the Big Bang, that image of an explosion we have in our heads, occurred at the end of the inflationary period, because inflation as a precursor is precisely what made the so-called explosion possible in the first place. It cannot have occurred after the Big Bang for two main reasons. First, since the singularity is the point which is calculated by extrapolating the expansion of the universe back in time, placing inflation afterwards would mean that the interpretations of the observations that lead you to come up with the Big Bang model in the first place are actually incorrect, producing a contradiction. Second, the cosmic microwave background radiation, which is assumed to have been produced by the Big Bang, and therefore is one of the strongest indicators that the Big Bang model is accurate, would be completely undetectable, since inflation with its massive rate of expansion would have stretched the radiation immeasurably thin. In popular media there is a serious lack of distinction between the Big Bang as a cosmological model and the actual beginning of everything. The Big Bang is simply what we imagine as the explosion of our observable universe, a result of the high-density state led to by cosmic inflation, sometimes also called the white hole at the beginning of time. The crucial point is that it is called a singularity because it is the point beyond which the mathematics that explain the current universe are not applicable, not because it is necessarily a beginning with any deeper metaphysical meaning. In my opinion, rather dishonest or at least sly attempt to avoid having to discuss it, this fact is usually left unmentioned presumably because it suggests that the Big Bang theory is actually not as good a model as it is made out to be. I do think however that explaining the whole story does not hurt the argument at all, because it provides a possible clue that can then be pursued in search of further explanations. Now there are many ways inflation could work. It is very possible that there was only eternal, timeless, empty space before the inflation period, or that inflation is eternal, which would mean our universe is infinitely large and we are only able to observe an infinitesimal portion of it. With respect to the Kalam argument, it tells us that, since the Big Bang is not the beginning of everything, and neither is inflation, it is a reasonable assumption that the universe might be, in some sense anyway, eternal and did not begin to exist. The objection that an expanding universe necessarily has a beginning is obviously nonsense as well, since if the universe can go on expanding forever, which our flat one is expected to do, it will be of infinite age after an infinite amount of time has passed. It may sound like a finite amount of time has to have passed to reach any point in time, but infinity is not a number nor some sort of end point. An infinite amount of numbers comes before and after infinity, so naturally, an infinite amount of time will have passed for an infinitely old universe. Our observable universe is of a finite age, but the whole universe may very well be infinitely old, or there may have passed an infinite amount of time before the inflation period. Even if that assumption should be incorrect, both the eternal or non-eternal nature of the universe and the God hypothesis are ultimately unprovable, so neither concept is necessarily to be preferred over the other, and we are not in a good enough position to assign meaningful probabilities to either. On top of that, premise 2 fails from a purely logical standpoint as well, simply because it is logically possible for the universe to have existed forever. Therefore the premise that it began to exist is merely an assumption, not a necessity. 3. Therefore, the universe has a cause. Taking my previous objections into account, this conclusion neither has a sound foundation, nor would it have any particular meaning if it had. I'd like to remind you that I am not saying the logic is flawed, rather that the statements made are not fully subject to formal logic. Moreover, even if the universe has a cause, it absolutely does not follow that that cause is a creator. Earthquakes have causes, but they are usually not created. At most the conclusion proposes that a cause exists, but that is not even necessarily the only or the penultimate one. Craig casually asserts that a cause of the universe is necessarily an uncaused, beginningless, changeless, timeless, spaceless, immaterial, enormously powerful, personal creator, which is a suspiciously detailed claim considering the very basic and general conclusion.
Having arrived at the conclusion that the universe has a cause, one may then do a conceptual analysis of what it means to be a cause of the universe. And one discovers that one is thereby brought to an uncaused, beginningless, changeless, timeless, spaceless, immaterial, enormously powerful, personal creator of the universe. Now, this argument is jarring because the conclusion, therefore, God almost certainly does not exist, comes at you out of left field without seemingly any preparation for it in the argument. You don't need to be a philosopher to realize that that conclusion doesn't follow from the 6 previous statements, even if they're true.
His criticism of Dawkins' conclusion is legitimate, but the exact same objection applies to his own. I think he is, or at least should be, well aware how dishonest and fallacious this is. Any of the proposed cosmological theories is supported just as well by this conclusion, which they should be, or they wouldn't be any good, and the God hypothesis is just one particularly weak addition to those. Personally, I think it would be a really sad day if it was proven that God created the universe at some point, because, with God being unknowable and all, it would put an end to any further inquiry into the nature of our universe. Finally, one should in general be very cautious if an argument claims to solve one of the most fundamental questions of mankind with 3 short sentences. If you look at the history of religion and the history of science, one very important observation should be quite obvious: science prides itself in the fact that incorrect, inaccurate or ignorant positions that were held by people in the past have been overturned or improved in light of new evidence over the course of the centuries. Scientists do not try to hide that they were wrong many times, and no one with a rational mindset has ever claimed that science had everything right from the beginning. Religion, on the other hand, has at its very core the idea that it was perfect from the beginning. So as a result, you should expect every religious person to be a biblical literalist who does not interpret anything from the Bible differently from people in the past and acts exactly like people did 2,000 years ago, stoning people to death and all. Since that is clearly not the case, must apologetics excuse atrocities of the past with the proverbial context within the time frame? But what they don't seem to grasp is that by doing so they unwittingly erode the very core of that which they think they are defending. If you accept that certain practices which are described in the Bible were morally justifiable in the past but are not anymore, and that we have evolved morally by discontinuing slavery and condemning the practice of stoning among many other things, you implicitly concede that the religion and the historical Bible it is based upon were not perfect to begin with but rather were in need of improvement. Or at the very least you would have to say that every barbarity described in the Bible is not to be taken literally, invent an interpretation that is morally justifiable by today's standards, and condemn everyone who might have acted according to a literal interpretation. Needless to say, I have never heard anyone state such an opinion. Additionally, God is said to be unchanging and an infallible author of perfect moral justice, so either the Bible is incorrect since it had to be improved upon, or everyone who is not following ancient religion is incorrect. If you really wanted to be consistent, you'd have to rewrite the Bible to be morally perfect by anyone's standards, but then you couldn't claim divine authority anymore, obviously. Either way, the Bible is not a source of commendable morality, and anyone who presents the all-too-well-known excuse "it was a different time" basically admits that. What I simply can't wrap my head around is why people are so hung up on ancient scriptures despite all the trouble they have with excusing their shortcomings. At the very least, I would expect them to have edited out the horrible parts so that it actually says what everyone claims it says. Especially since belief in God does not require the Bible, right?